the topic of the morning is the connection between national security and international trade, and it's interesting, it's important, and the connection is quite frequently missed by reporters. Uh, uh, Generally speaking, the connection between trade and security is obvious because countries that trade peaceably with each other tend not to go to war. And you know enough of your economic history to know that there used to be real shooting wars over when countries seized other countries' markets, and trade was for domination, not for mutual benefit. So the more Ukraine and all of us, all the countries trade with other countries, especially Russia, the better the chances are for peace. Everybody knows that. That's why we're talking about the subject. I believe the reason that most reporters tend to miss the connection is the way newsrooms are organized. You'll have the Washington Post or New York Times. You'll have to translate in your own minds what's relevant to Ukraine, but you'll have national security reporters who will spend all of their energies in covering the Pentagon or whatever, defense issues, arms purchases, Afghanistan. So when trade issues come up, they won't see them, because to write about trade well, you have to understand a rather specialized world, and the two are connected, but it's not obvious. I recently have been writing about Vietnam, and some of the leading authorities on U.S.-Vietnamese relations don't know what's going on in the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade talks, which are closely linked to security. We'll talk about that. So the reason this is more natural for me is that I don't work in a newsroom where I'm assigned to agriculture or trade or defense or whatever. I don't have to worry about turf. And my own background, of course, is in the national security area, and economics was just added later on, and it's just another window into the same world. So, I mean, in foreign affairs, you have defense, intelligence, diplomacy, cultural exchanges, economics. They're all windows into the same room, and they're all connected one way or the other. The obvious explain how the coverage works a little bit from the American example, and then we'll get away from America and get back into Ukraine. But the Trans-Pacific trade talks, TPP, is the acronym familiar? No reason it should be. I hate acronyms, as you know. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is a trade deal that started between four pretty clean free trading countries: Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile, and then they added on Brunei, which is near Borneo, and it's just kind of an oil-rich little sheikdom. But they called them the P4, and they knocked down their trade barriers and had a trade deal. They asked the United States to join Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the U.S. then, in our characteristic fashion, came in and has taken over the whole process and tried to stamp Washington's will on the whole trade negotiations, which have unfortunately been held in great secrecy, so you don't know exactly what's going on. It's at the heart of President Obama's strategy, the famous pivot to Asia. He came in 2009, didn't have a trade policy for the first year. It got to be a little embarrassing, and so he picked up on the TPP, saying we're going to have a pivot to Asia. I think a lot of it was just PR spin, and then to Obama's surprise, people believed him. And so the idea was to pivot to Asia, connect the security in Asia to the economics. And the security part is easy to understand. The U.S. 7th Fleet has been patrolling the Pacific waters since World War II. As an American, I'm proud of the fact that we have helped keep the sea lanes peaceful and have not tried to exercise domination in the traditional sense of the word. And even the Chinese welcome our presence there because it keeps Japan quiet. And it's very interesting, and we could talk about that, but you probably all see the general picture there. So the Obama's pivot was to connect the security to the economics, and this is where the PR spin comes in. Most people in journalism have bought into it, but the security part's been there for over half a century. There's nothing new. The economics is the TPP. So the United States is going to be connected economically to Asia, and the TPP negotiations now involve 12 countries. Canada and Japan have joined in. You have Malaysia, Vietnam, a couple others. And here's the disconnect. The idea is for the U.S. to be a counter to China economically, but you only have 12 countries, and most of them are pretty small, and Japan just came in very late in the game. So you split Southeast Asia, pitting one trading partner of the U.S. against another. Vietnam would get privileges as a member of the TPP. The Philippines wouldn't. Neither would Thailand. So, and then the bigger scheme of things is this is an anti-China exercise where the U.S. wants to give countries an alternative to China. China then has been smarter than the Americans, has been negotiating trade deals with everybody in Asia, and the Chinese have been stepping up their economic advancement, and the poor Obama White House has nothing really going on finishing the TPP, and they're desperate. And so that's generally what's going on. I hate it when journalists say these are my greatest stories and all that, but I'm ahead of just about everybody else on this one, and happy to say so. After the recent summit, APEC summit, Asian Pacific Economic Forum in Bali, where President Obama famously couldn't go because he had domestic turmoil in Washington. People have started to catch up with the fact that there's something wrong here. But what's wrong is what I've told you. You just look at where the numbers and the trade goes, and you can see that favoring some trading partners at the expense of others just doesn't work. And just this morning, the headlines are full of a statement that the Prime Minister of Canada made, saying that we're going to cut a free trade arrangement with the European Union. So everybody's moving on except the Americans, and that's a national security matter of concern. So when you think of such developments elsewhere, hopefully it will have some relevance to the obvious national security economic issues that your country's involved with. Number one, Russia. And even though this is my third day here and I know more now than the local people about how to run their affairs, I don't think I'm going to dare suggest how you handle Russia. But that obviously, the more you trade with them and the more you work out the issues, the better. And you've all thought this through more deeply than I have. So, good luck, because it's important. As far as if we're sitting around in a newsroom looking for stories on national security and trade, the uranium enrichment issue is the obvious one. And I'm very sorry. I wrote some of the first stories about how that was supposed to work back in the late 80s, early 1990s, and I can't remember what's happened since then. But I would start by going to the Milken Institute Review, it's the Economics Quarterly, and just punch in Milken Institute Review, United States Enrichment Corporation, that or uranium, and you'll find an excellent story written a few years ago by somebody who'd been in the I believe the Clinton White House, maybe George W.'s White House, but whoever it was, very smart. And so there's an ongoing story there. Maybe you're already ahead of me on that because it's so close to you and so important. If not, that's one opportunity. Can I slow down here and stop? Is anybody doing anything on that particular story, or is there any thoughts on how you might cover Russia and your Ukraine issues better, or some of the risks if you do? What's it like? Yeah, that it's very sensible because otherwise you'd be writing editorials or commentaries and taking a position. And so on the issue of the Russians are retaliating against Ukrainian chocolate because of an action Ukraine made to limit exports of Russian cars or imports of Russian. I mean, what's that about? Who makes automobiles here, and who would care how many imports you have from Russia, Japan, or anywhere? There's another very important story. I mentioned it yesterday. Ukraine is a new member of the World Trade Organization, negotiated terms of entry, and then a couple years later has announced it's going to raise tariffs on more than $3 billion of imports. It's viewed in in the WTO circles. Well, they're angry. They're saying, "Come on, you join, you agree to things, and now you're not keeping your word." It's a very serious matter, and it ought to be reported upon, but not in an angry style. You can, but the issue has to be addressed if trade is going to be covered responsibly here, because it has the concern of 100 and some other countries around the world. And Turkey has announced it's going to retaliate against Ukrainian exports of walnuts. Is that news? Yeah. Yes. Okay. Has anything gone beyond that headline? Well, there's your reason for a story. There are two stories there. You have Ukrainian walnuts. Somebody in Ukraine grows walnuts and exports them, or there's a place to go to. How are they affected if Turkey does this? So the lead is that Ukraine has announced it's going to raise these tariffs, and now the law of unintended consequences. Turkey's not only taking prisoners, they're threatening to shoot them. And the hostages here are the walnut people in your crane. So you go to the walnut company, and how do you feel being held hostage? That's classic trade theory played out in reality. So there's a story. I have no idea where walnuts come from, uh, but that ought to be reported. Second story: Japan has taken Ukraine to the dispute resolution process in Geneva. The proceedings of these trade cases are usually confidential. Sometimes with the Americans or Europeans, countries that have more open traditions, the papers are more public, and even sometimes the sessions are public, but probably not in this case. So Japan has lawyers working on the case. If you call the Japanese embassy to go in to try to get a briefing, who's listening on the phone? What is that the smartest thing to do first? Does Japan have a trade association here? Japanese Chamber of Commerce? Is Toyota perhaps a member of that? Sometimes the companies are all right, I'm here in Ukraine and I want to do this story. First thing I'm thinking of, I want to call the Japanese embassy, but I'm not going to pick up that phone and do it because somebody's listening. Right? Am I paranoid or no? I wouldn't start there. I'd end there. But so who here represents Japanese commercial interests? Law firm? I'd be quiet, but I'd find those people. There are many good law firms in Brussels and Geneva, and somebody there would be handling this case. The Japanese Trade Ministry wouldn't have the legal expertise or the technical expertise on automobiles to argue such a case. For obvious reasons. I mean, they can't be experts in everything, but the lawyers, there will be a lawyer here. You find the lawyers, there's a public record somewhere. Can you travel to Brussels or Geneva? Is it easy to get travel? Yeah. You need, how about an ordinary Ukrainian citizen? They can go without a visa? When I came to Ukraine, I didn't need a visa. I mean, at some point, the decision in the WTO will be published. And so you can get the story even after it happens and explain what happened and why. Yeah. These things can go on for what, a year, a couple of years, but at some point, then you're going to have a published decision, and you can write the story even then and explain in great detail what the issues were and what happened, and there will be consequences for your crane. So you can do it to the front end or the back end, because the Toyotas and the other Japanese cars probably made in the EU somewhere, right? So that's the Japanese industry. It's really a European industry. Well, I guess there's not much more to say there, but at some point, there will be a lot more information on the record when the WTO decision is announced, and the question then will be, will your crane comply? I haven't followed the case. I don't know. It can take a year or two, and there will be a preliminary ruling and then probably an appeal, and there will be extensive information on the record at some point. The the other question is that there are cases against Russia, and what people want to know is, will the Russians comply? I remember when the Russians joined the WTO, it was like 2 years ago, in Geneva, and you go up and talk to them and say, now you understand this is really going to make Russia go down the road to the rule of law, and they say, yeah, we get that, and so people are watching that, and so you have always the contrast between who will comply better, the Russians or Ukrainians. It's a safe guess that if Japan has brought a case, they'll win it, because most of the cases brought in the WTO are solid. They would, I mean, the law's not that difficult. If a country discriminates against another country's products, it's pretty clear. Usually, the rules are not that ambiguous. If you can go to the WTO and find information on the dispute settlements, how many have affected which country, which products, what's happened, and that's useful information for background for any story. And without going to Geneva, you might find stuff on the WTO's website that would be helpful. Does the World Health Organization have an office in Kiev? I mean, if anybody hates the cigarette companies, it's the World Health Organization. It might be worth a call to go over and get to know them and ask them what you're following the case. What about it? Maybe they have a lot of information. Maybe they know who the lawyers are. I don't know, but before deciding not to proceed with the story, you might want to go to the WHO. What law firms are? The law firms wouldn't be here. They'd be in Brussels or Geneva.
Actually, we have a lot of anti-tobacco organizations
Here?
that fights against spreading these manufacturers all over Ukraine, and they just say it's a very big shame for Ukrainian democracy, diplomacy, because
Well,
decision to fight with
they have a point, and yet maybe there's a backwards way into the story. Australia complains that, wait a minute, you're taking our intellectual property when you say that we don't have the right to no. Philip Morris has a complaint that our intellectual property and our rights to sell a legal product are being interfered with by the Australians. So maybe you could go and get more of their side on the record and ask them to explain why they ought to win the case, why Ukraine should. One of my mentors used to tell me, I love it when they lie, because I'll print those lies. And then later on, there will be an accounting. But there is a legitimate side of that story. If I write this, I want that because it's important, and there are concerns about intellectual property and the rights of company not to have governments come in and just wipe them out. I mean, it's cigarettes today, but it could be fettuccine Alfredo tomorrow, and I would take that personally. Or Coca-Cola, bad. A lot of stuff bad for you, just as bad as cigarettes, actually. So, without being a front for the Ukrainian big tobacco companies, you could probably do an honest story and advance. The point is advance the public record. In fact, it's not a bad idea, because if Ukraine is going to file the case, they ought to explain why they think they should win. And it's interesting that the anti-tobacco people are easy to understand because they're right. I mean, tobacco is terrible, but the other side of it is usually dismissed. The other side meaning, Philip Morris has legitimate interest. I mean, it's not popular, but they do, and you don't have to take their side to report it. So, worth a call, maybe. I don't know. On the issue of Ukraine has raised all these concerns in Geneva by the tariff hikes under this Article 28 process in the WTO. There's a story there. The Global Trade Alert has the details of the products that are involved in this. Did anybody have time last night to glance through that? I didn't either. We've all had a lot to do, but those specific products that are involved, some of them are like roses and catfish and cars and cigarettes. They're good issues to deal in. I would just go over the Global Trade Alert and look and see what's interesting, and then you could the lead of such a story would highlight the general concerns about what Ukraine has done. And there's not much more to say. I mean, the concerns are there, and then you just start explaining it through one or two of the products involved, and you drill deeply. So your story would be about not catfish, but something like that. And if you go through Global Trade Alert, you'll find them. There's no doubt. And I could pick up this and start going through now, but it's probably not worth it. You need to dig into the Ukrainian agriculture system. The answer is no. Quotas are always bad. Subsidies to prop up farmers who can't compete are always bad. But remember I said yesterday there are no virgins in international trade. I mean, consider the American farm subsidies. Your wheat farmers have to compete with American wheat farmers who are basically paid by the U.S. taxpayer. And so it's not fair. The European Union's Common Agricultural Program affects Ukraine. And so whatever Ukraine is doing, there are no good guys and bad guys that are that clear. The way to get sources on that might be to start looking at Ukraine's concerns in the WTO on food security. Food security, is part of this. I would start in the WTO. There's an agricultural section there. There's a press officer from Thailand, Peter Ungpakorn. I don't have to spell it for you, but call the WTO press office and say, would they give you a briefing on where Ukrainian agricultural issues fit into the WTO? And before your government goes to Bali for the WTO ministerial in December, try to get them to explain what they want to accomplish in the Doha negotiations or in the WTO. Those are very important stories. I don't know the answers, but the way to start down the trail is in Geneva, and there will be people who will help you. And the Andrew Crosby, a couple of the other names I suggested yesterday, the NGOs in Geneva will help you, it's important. Yeah. All I can say, pull this string and good things will happen. You're going to get interesting stories. I personally don't have all the answers at the tip of my tongue, but yeah, do it. Please do it. I mean, I'd like to read it.
How do you personally see protectionism? Should it be a natural part of the state's policy, or is it something that government takes away, or is it a function that government takes away from the market? How should it be covered not to be just populist? How do protectionism, how should it be covered in the media?
go back to the Mark Levinson lessons, protectionism equals poverty. If it's based upon a fear of competition, a desire to create national champions, economic nationalism is mixed in with patriotic feelings, it doesn't work. The European Union protected the high-tech industry. The semiconductors were developed in Texas, Texas Instruments. Those semiconductor chips have done more to change the world than any of the politicians you've had in the last 30 years. And the European Union protected their domestic industry because they wanted to create European champions in high technology. Well, the Silicon Valley just killed them. And Motorola, which later ran into problems on its own, but companies like that moved to Europe. And finally the Europeans adopted free trade. Protection, if you want to produce everything you eat and protect your local people and feel good and patriotic, you're going to end up the difference between Chicago and Calcutta, right? Horrible poverty and dynamism. In the other hand, it never works. It's seductive. It sounds good, especially when they say buy Ukrainian. I don't think that's editorializing. I just think it's fact, because it won't work. And remember, the reason we're all in this is that we want Ukraine to be prosperous. I care just for foreign policy reasons, considering where you are in the world. I mean, this is a very important country. It ought to be one of the top priorities for the United States, because the more prosperous and independent you are, the better. As journalists, the only other advice, it's fun to go to the protectionists and hear their sob stories, and they'll be happy to have you write them. And once you lay it all out, readers will decide pretty much for themselves who's right and who's wrong. And like when you go to your local car people, and then go to the Skoda factory, both of them employ Ukrainians. One has a future. Terrific. Yeah. Well, that ends it then. Look, we have fair trade. We want free and fair trade. When you hear the word fair trade, watch your wallet. You go on the website of the Office of the United States Trade Representative, and it says, here are assuming it's not dark. I think the shutdown's over for a while. And when you get on the website, click under benefits of trade. And this is from the American government standpoint. It's all about exports. Imports are not mentioned. So the workers in Boeing who make Dreamliners out of 70% imported components from Sweden, Japan, and UK, and I think there's some Ukrainian stuff in there. Not sure, but those workers are American workers, but they need the world. Probably the best way, rather than me just rant, is if you go to the WTO and the OECD websites, there's a Made in the World initiative. The Swedish government, the Board of National Trade, has published some really good economic studies on this, showing where an automobile comes from. And Made in the World is the way to defeat protectionism, because you can't make anything in any one country. And the more you write about the contribution of imports to Ukrainian jobs, manufacturing jobs, the harder it is for the protectionists to use those what's that word he says? National pragmatism. That's great. I mean, what a phrase. So, yeah, I like that. Yeah. Okay. No, there's a lot of misleading PR spin to that. When it makes sense, companies can bring some jobs back, but it's not because of any U.S. government policy or any fundamental economic switch. The President Obama went to Milwaukee, Wisconsin during his campaign last year, and went to a padlock factory, just basic locks that are in every American high school locker, and they had moved 100 workers back to Milwaukee. He moved them back from China, but so this was Buy American. We make things here in America. But those padlocks can't be made just in Milwaukee. There are maybe 13 parts to a padlock, springs, lock washers, all kinds of stuff. They'll come from places like China. And so Master Lock will bring in one case there were 13 parts to the padlock made in Milwaukee. 2 of them only came from Taiwan. The rest were manufactured in the U.S., but those 2 comprised maybe 1/3 of the value of the lock. So without those 2 parts, those Americans wouldn't have jobs. And then in other cases, most of the assembly and operation was done in Milwaukee. They bring in parts from China, they put the locks together in Milwaukee, and then they'd send them to Mexico for the final assembly. Then the products were labeled "Made in Mexico." But were they? In the U.S., there's a website called Cross Customs Rulings, and it's the U.S. Customs rulings. Companies apply for duty treatment on their imported components. That's where I learned the Master Lock story. The company wouldn't talk to me. They were Republicans and they hated Obama, but he came to visit them and they had to be courteous to a president. And then he held them up as his example of jobs moving back to the U.S. and every reporter there bought that. Nobody questioned it because there wasn't time. And so my source was the Cross Customs Rulings, and easy as that. I check it all the time. The other side of it, there's a little economics involved, and it's interesting. When a company moves jobs offshore, it's criticized by politicians, and you're asking about the U.S., so I'll stick to that example. There was a big issue between the Republican candidate Mitt Romney and Obama over who was the biggest outsourcer. And the Washington Post wrote a story saying that when Mitt Romney had been in the private equity business, Bain Capital, Bain had pioneered outsourcing. And the Washington Post story became central to the campaign. It got picked up. Obama advertised, portrayed Romney in dark terms as an outsourcer, rather un-American. Well, the Washington Post outsources its subscription services to the Philippines. So the job of the reporter who went around exposing outsourcing as if it were shameful, his own job is sustained because the Post has been bleeding advertising dollars, so they take the subscription calls. I mean, when my Washington Post isn't delivered, or I want to put a stop or buy more, I call and I get a Philippine voice on the other end. That was my secret source. I know the accent, and so I started speaking Tagalog, and never found out where the factory was. But so. And I wrote that story, and then I didn't want to call the reporter and embarrass him because poor guy, he did an honest story. He didn't know that, and I didn't want to call any of the editors there because why bother? So I called the communications people, the PR people for the Washington Post, and there are 2 of them. One's the Washington Post Corporation, and the other one's for the newspaper. Neither one answered a couple of emails, so I put that in the story. And I said one didn't respond, and the other one declined comment. And I said declined comment because I didn't want to say didn't acknowledge twice because of the bad language. Oh boy, then I heard from her. Why'd you say I declined comment? I wouldn't even talk to you. And I said, well, you're the spinmeister. And I just thought I'd put it in just so people would know I tried to contact the paper, and I didn't want to make a big deal out of it because I love the Post, and I've written for it. And she said, I am not a spinmeister. I am the communications director for the Washington Post. I thought, well, all right. So, yeah. So even newspapers don't handle PR all that well. The economic side of it is that if you're talking about outsourcing, the United States government outsources defense and intelligence and other kinds of backroom services so we can support our spies, because we want to pay our spies rather than the people who do the paperwork and all that. So the paperwork for some of the defense intelligence work is done in India, Bangalore, I think, and hundreds of millions of dollars are spent. It's wise spending of U.S. tax dollars because you're saving money, just like the Washington Post when it outsources. The other way, and I hate to try to compete with Mark Levinson and a real pro, but when you talk about outsourcing, you have companies like Nike that have outsourced the production to China and other countries. And there's something economists call a smiley curve. Just goes like this, looks like a little smile face, and along the curve it measures the value of the production of that shoe. And you have research, design, marketing, advertising, American workers and doing all that, and that's 70% of the value. The bottom 30% of the cost of the shoe are the labor in China. So Nike employs a lot more Americans because they don't make the shoes in the United States. And that's an intellectual argument. It's difficult to make politically, but it's true. We have a company called New Balance that has maybe 1/10 of the American workers in the shoes, as does Nike and Adidas, the German company. And New Balance says, well, we're Americans, but the New Balance brings in parts of its shoe. They're uppers and downers, and they glue them together in Massachusetts and Maine, and they bring them in from China duty free or almost duty free, and then they say made in America, and and I've written a lot about this, but one thing about the trade press is that you got to get into these details to get the stories, and you search the web for such details, and there aren't many of us who write that, but it's fun when you do.